New York had a heartbeat, but that night, it slowed to a dangerous whisper. A boy named Salvatore Luciano was about to teach the city how silence could be power. The city never really slept. New York was too restless for that, too full of noise, sweat, and the kind of hunger that didn't go away with a meal. On the Lower East Side, the streets were alive with the chatter of immigrant families, pushcart vendors shouting over one another, and the rattle of streetcars that never seemed to stop. But every once in a while, the streets went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. No, the kind that meant someone was watching, waiting, ready to strike. And when you're a kid growing up here, you learn real fast to listen to those silences. Salvatore Lucania, yeah, that was my name before they called me Lucky, grew up in that silence. My family came from Sicily, like a lot of others. We didn't have much. My father was a plasterer, a hard worker who thought the American dream was something you could grab with your hands if you just held on tight enough. But me? I saw the truth early. Dreams didn't come to kids like us. Survival did. Respect, maybe, if you earned it. And fear. Fear was the currency that bought you both. The tenements smelled like garlic, coal smoke, and too many people living too close. We were packed into those apartments like sardines, whole families sharing one room, one sink, one hope that tomorrow would be better than today. I remember looking out the window at night, hearing the drunken fights, the breaking bottles, the distant screams. And in that chaos, I felt something most kids didn't: calm. A strange calm. Like the worse it got, the steadier I became. That's where it started, where the streets gave me my edge. I wasn't born lucky. That name, that reputation, it came later. What I had as a kid was instinct. I could see angles, read people. The tough kids wanted to fight their way out. The smart kids wanted to study their way out. Me? I wanted to think my way out. And thinking, on these streets, was as sharp as a switchblade. I ran errands, carried messages, watched who paid protection and who didn't. Small stuff, sure, but every job was a lesson. You learned who could be trusted, who talked too much, who cracked under pressure. You learned that a smile could hide a lie and that sometimes silence was the loudest weapon in the room. There was a corner we used to hang around, Mulberry Street. If you stood there long enough, you could see the whole theater of New York crime play out in front of you: the Italian gangs, the Jewish crews, the Irish toughs, everybody carving out their little slice of the city. And in the middle of all that noise, I knew one thing: I wasn't gonna be a soldier in somebody else's war. I was gonna write my own rules. The first time I felt that silence I was talking about, the kind that hangs heavy over a street, it was a muggy summer night. A couple of kids were running a dice game in the alley, lantern light flickering against the walls. Then, just like that, the laughter stopped. No more dice clattering. No more voices. Just stillness. I looked around, and I could see it in their eyes. Trouble was walking our way. Two older guys, local toughs, stepped into the alley. They wanted the pot, the coins, the nickels and dimes the kids had scraped together. The other boys froze. But not me. I stepped forward, small as I was, and I looked one of them dead in the eye. Didn't flinch, didn't move. Just calm. And you know what? He laughed. Tossed me a coin and said, "This kid's got stones." Then they took the rest and walked. The other kids thought I was crazy. But me? I knew something different. I just tasted the first drop of power. Not by fighting. Not by begging. By standing steady when everyone else shook. That calm? That was gonna take me places. Growing up in the Lower East Side wasn't just about food and rent. It was about respect. And respect wasn't given, it was taken, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in screams. I learned quick that people remembered two things: who scared them and who stood calm while others panicked. Both were valuable. But one, calm, that was unforgettable. See, the streets raised me. They gave me scars, sure, but they also gave me wisdom. Every broken bottle on the curb, every fight in the alley, every silence before a storm, it all whispered the same thing: if you can keep your head while everyone else loses theirs, you own the room. And the room in New York was the world. People ask me sometimes, what made you different, Lucky? What made you rise? It wasn't luck. Not really. It was knowing when to keep my mouth shut, when to keep my hands steady, and when to let silence do the talking. That night on the streets, when the dice game went quiet, I didn't just stand up to a couple of toughs. I learned a truth I carried my whole life: power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, power whispers. Sometimes it's the calm in your chest when a gun's pointed at you. Sometimes it's the smile when everyone else is shouting. Sometimes it's the silence that makes the other guy wonder what you're thinking. And let me tell you, once you learn that, you're never just another kid on the block. You're something else. So when I say the streets fell silent that night, I don't just mean the dice game. I mean me. My future. My rise. That was the night the noise of New York faded, and the calm that would carry me through betrayals, wars, and midnight deals, finally spoke. Because before they called me lucky, before I ran rackets, before the commission and the betrayals, there was just a boy standing still in the silence. A boy who learned that calm could be sharper than any blade. And that's where the story really begins. You don't get a name like Lucky unless the streets give it to you, and trust me, the streets don't hand out favors for free. They still called me Salvatore back then, Salvatore Lucania, the son of a plasterer from Lercora Fritti, Sicily. My old man wanted me to be respectable, wanted me to walk straight to work with my hands, to live honest. But the streets don't care about honest. Honest didn't put food on the table. Honest didn't buy respect. And honest sure as hell didn't keep your face out of the gutter when the wrong crowd wanted a piece of you. By the time I was 10, I was already running errands for the local gang boys. I carried messages, collected coins, and sometimes, when nobody was looking, I pocketed a few myself. The Lower East Side wasn't a place for dreamers. It was survival, every hour of every day. You learned quick, or you didn't last long. School? That wasn't for me. I dropped out in 6th grade. Not because I was dumb, don't let anyone tell you that. No, I was sharp. Too sharp to sit in a classroom while the other kids read from books that weren't gonna change their lives. The lessons I needed weren't in books. They were out there on the corners, in the alleys, in the whispers behind the barbershop where the men in sharp suits talked business. That's where I belonged. I started making a little crew of my own. Just kids at first, running petty rackets, charging other boys a nickel for protection on the way to school, stealing cigarettes, shaking down fruit vendors who knew better than to argue with a pack of toughs. It was childish, sure, but it taught me something: people pay not because they have to, but because they're afraid not to. That lesson? That stuck with me. And then there was the night I got my name, Lucky. Some people think it was because I always walked away when the bullets started flying. Others think it was because I was smart enough to dodge prison when half my friends ended up behind bars. But the real story? It started with a fight I wasn't supposed to win. There was this gang of Italian kids, a little older than me, calling themselves the 5 Points Juniors. Tough crowd. One night, they cornered me in an alley 5 against 1. They wanted to teach me a lesson for muscling in on their corner. I should have been left bleeding in the gutter. Instead, I stood my ground. I took the punches, I gave a few back, and when it was over, I was still standing. Barely, but standing. The next day, the whispers started: that kid? He's lucky. And the name stuck. But let me tell you, luck had nothing to do with it. What they called luck, I called calculation. I didn't win fights by swinging harder. I won by knowing when to swing and when to stand still. That's not luck. That's survival. Around this time, I started noticing a couple of kids who weren't like the rest. One of them was Meyer Lansky, a Jewish kid, sharp as a razor, eyes that never missed a thing. He had a way of looking at the world that matched mine. He didn't want to fight for scraps, he wanted the whole table. Then there was Benny Siegel, Bugsy, they called him. Hot-headed, wild, but fearless. If Meyer was the brain, and I was the balance, Bugsy was the fire. Together? We were dangerous. Most gangs back then stuck to their own kind, Italians with Italians, Jews with Jews, Irish with Irish. But me and Meyer? We didn't care about that. We saw opportunity where others saw walls. The old-timers called us foolish, but we knew something they didn't: money doesn't care what language you speak. It only cares whose pocket it ends up in. We started running dice games together, fixing card tables, cutting deals with bootleggers before Prohibition even hit. Small time, sure, but it was enough to feel the rush of real power. Enough to taste what it meant to bend the rules and come out on top. And through it all, I kept my calm. That was the difference. Benny would throw punches, Meyer would run the numbers, but me? I kept everyone steady. I made sure the deals didn't collapse, that nobody got too greedy too fast, that we all walked away alive and richer than we started. But make no mistake, the streets still had teeth. I got picked up by the cops more than once: petty theft, extortion, assault. They booked me, they fingerprinted me, they threw me in a cell overnight. But somehow, I always walked. The charges never stuck. Witnesses forgot what they saw. Evidence went missing. And the whispers grew louder: that kid? He's lucky. It wasn't luck, though. It was preparation. It was knowing who to pay off, who to keep close, and when to keep my mouth shut. The cops learned quick that I wasn't some punk kid they could scare. I looked them in the eye and smiled. Calm. Always calm. And it rattled them. By my late teens, I wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. I had a reputation. People knew the name Lucky Luciano. And that name carried weight. It made people think twice before crossing me. It made people curious, too curious enough to want to do business. And that's the key: see. A name, a reputation, it's like a weapon. You don't have to swing it every time. Most of the time, you just let people know you've got it, and they fall in line on their own. That's how I went from Salvatore, the plasterer's son, to Lucky, the kid who couldn't be stopped. And in New York, in those days, once you had a name, you had the first brick in the foundation of an empire. But names only take you so far. To build something bigger, to rise above the noise, you need more than reputation. You need opportunity. And in the Roaring '20s, America handed us the biggest opportunity we could have asked for: a law meant to clean up the country that ended up drowning it in money, liquor, and blood. Prohibition. And that, my friend, was where the real story began. America tried to go dry. But New York? We were drowning in liquor, and I was learning how to swim better than anyone else. You want to know what built empires? It wasn't bullets, not really. It wasn't gambling, girls, or loan sharking. Nah, it was liquor. Simple as that. When America tried to dry out in 1920, the whole country got thirsty. And when a country gets thirsty, somebody's gonna sell 'em a drink. That somebody was us. The government thought it could change people overnight with the stroke of a pen. The Volstead Act, Prohibition. They said no more alcohol. No beer, no wine, no whiskey. Just like that. But tell me, when has a law ever stopped desire? When has it ever stopped greed? The day they banned alcohol was the day the underworld struck gold. Liquid gold. And we were ready. New York became the capital of that gold rush. The streets buzzed louder than ever, not with open saloons, but with whispers. Whispered addresses of speakeasies hidden behind barber shops, restaurants, and basements. The city was a maze of secret doors and coded knocks. And if you wanted a drink, you had to know someone like me. See, me, Meyer, and Benny, we weren't just kids hustling anymore. Prohibition made us businessmen, whether the law liked it or not. One night you're scraping nickels out of dice games, the next you're moving crates of Canadian whiskey across the Hudson under the noses of the Coast Guard. Opportunity had knocked, and we weren't just answering, we were breaking down the door. The money was insane. People talk about bootlegging like it was just smuggling bottles. No. It was an entire machine. You had the importers bringing liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, even Europe. You had the truck drivers, the dock workers, the cops who looked the other way, for a fee, of course. You had the speakeasy owners, the musicians, the politicians taking their cut. It wasn't crime, it was an economy. And if you were smart enough to keep calm in the middle of it, you could own the city. That's where Arnold Rothstein comes in. Rothstein wasn't just another gambler. He was the brain behind the operation, the mentor who showed me that organized crime could be just that, organized. He taught me to see past the street brawls and petty turf wars. He said, "Lucky, you don't fight for corners, you buy the building." And I listened. Rothstein was the guy who saw Prohibition for what it was, the business opportunity of the century. He taught us to think like executives, not street thugs. Every shipment was a deal, every deal was a partnership, every partnership was a chess move. We weren't stealing, we were managing an underground empire. But let me tell you, the streets didn't go quiet. Not with this kind of money floating around. Everyone wanted a piece. Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, Italian families, they all wanted their cut. The cops wanted theirs too. You think you're paying for protection? No. You're paying for silence. And silence is expensive. Speakeasies were popping up everywhere. They say there were over 20,000 in New York alone, more than there ever were legal bars before Prohibition. And behind every one, there was a network of men like me, making sure the liquor flowed. Benny loved those places, the lights, the music, the women. He thrived in the chaos. Meyer loved the numbers, the profits stacked higher every week. Me? I loved the control. I loved knowing that if you wanted to drink in my city, you were drinking because I allowed it. But success paints a target on your back. The cops raided places left and right. Rivals tried hijacking shipments. Some nights, bullets flew faster than bottles. I remember one deal where a truckload of whiskey was supposed to make it from Jersey into Manhattan. By the time it hit the bridge, another crew tried to take it. Gunfire in the dark, headlights cutting through smoke, tires screeching on wet pavement. Most men would panic. Me? I stayed calm. I told the driver to keep going, foot on the gas, eyes forward. We made it across with half the bottles broken but our profit intact. That's the difference. Panic loses shipments. Calm keeps the money flowing. And while others fought over scraps, I kept my eyes higher. Rothstein drilled it into me: why fight wars when you can cut deals? Why spill blood when you can shake hands? That's what Prohibition was teaching me. You don't rule the streets by force alone. You rule them by making sure everyone eats just enough to keep them loyal. We started working with crews nobody thought we'd touch. Italians and Jews, Irish and Poles. If they moved liquor, we found a way to move it together. It wasn't about heritage, it was about profit. That was new. That was the future. The old bosses didn't like it, but they were too busy shooting each other to stop us. The public? They didn't care. They were too busy drinking. The rich threw parties in penthouses with champagne flowing like water. The working man downed shots in smoky backrooms after a long shift. Ministers preached temperance by day, then sipped gin by night. Everybody was in on it. Everybody was guilty. And we were laughing all the way to the bank. But Prohibition wasn't just money, it was blood. Too much blood. Gangs fought for territory like wolves. Truck hijackings turned into street massacres. Politicians who couldn't be bought ended up buried. The city was a battlefield, every corner a war zone. And yet, in the middle of it all, I stayed calm. That's what made me different. That's what kept me alive. One night, after a particularly bloody shootout between rival crews, Meyer turned to me and said, "Lucky, this can't last. They're gonna kill each other till there's nothing left." And he was right. The city was eating itself alive. But I knew something he didn't, not yet. I knew that one day, I'd be the one to bring order to the chaos. One day, I'd turn this madness into something organized, something permanent. That seed was planted in the smoke and blood of Prohibition. Because when the law tells the people they can't have what they want, the underworld steps up to give it to them. And when the underworld steps up, somebody's gotta lead it. Somebody calm, steady, smart enough to see the bigger picture. That somebody was me. So when you think about Prohibition, don't just think about speakeasies and jazz. Think about the foundations of an empire. Think about kids from the Lower East Side turning into businessmen in silk suits. Think about midnight shipments across the Hudson, deals whispered in cigar smoke, and a calm voice in the middle of chaos saying, "Keep moving. We're not done yet." Because Prohibition didn't just make us rich. It made us powerful. It turned me from a hustler into a visionary. And once you taste that kind of power, you don't go back. No, you keep climbing. You keep building. And you start planning for the day when the old guard falls and the new order rises. And trust me, that day was coming. America tried to go dry. But New York? We were drowning in liquor, and I was learning how to swim better than anyone else. You want to know what built empires? It wasn't bullets, not really. It wasn't gambling, girls, or loan sharking. Nah, it was liquor. Simple as that. When America tried to dry out in 1920, the whole country got thirsty. And when a country gets thirsty, somebody's gonna sell them a drink. That somebody was us. The government thought it could change people overnight with the stroke of a pen. The Volstead Act, Prohibition. They said no more alcohol. No beer, no wine, no whiskey. Just like that. But tell me, when has a law ever stopped desire? When has it ever stopped greed? The day they banned alcohol was the day the underworld struck gold. Liquid gold. And we were ready. New York became the capital of that gold rush. The streets buzzed louder than ever, not with open saloons, but with whispers. Whispered addresses of speakeasies hidden behind barbershops, restaurants, and basements. The city was a maze of secret doors and coded knocks. And if you wanted a drink, you had to know someone like me. See, me, Meyer, and Benny, we weren't just kids hustling anymore. Prohibition made us businessmen, whether the law liked it or not. One night you're scraping nickels out of dice games, the next you're moving crates of Canadian whiskey across the Hudson under the noses of the Coast Guard. Opportunity had knocked, and we weren't just answering, we were breaking down the door. The money was insane. People talk about bootlegging like it was just smuggling bottles. No. It was an entire machine. You had the importers bringing liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, even Europe. You had the truck drivers, the dock workers, the cops who looked the other way, for a fee, of course. You had the speakeasy owners, the musicians, the politicians taking their cut. It wasn't crime, it was an economy. And if you were smart enough to keep calm in the middle of it, you could own the city. That's where Arnold Rothstein comes in. Rothstein wasn't just another gambler. He was the brain behind the operation, the mentor who showed me that organized crime could be just that, organized. He taught me to see past the street brawls and petty turf wars. He said, "Lucky, you don't fight for corners, you buy the building." And I listened. Rothstein was the guy who saw Prohibition for what it was, the business opportunity of the century. He taught us to think like executives, not street thugs. Every shipment was a deal, every deal was a partnership, every partnership was a chess move. We weren't stealing, we were managing an underground empire. But let me tell you, the streets didn't go quiet. Not with this kind of money floating around. Everyone wanted a piece. Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, Italian families, they all wanted their cut. The cops wanted theirs too. You think you're paying for protection? No. You're paying for silence. And silence is expensive. Speakeasies were popping up everywhere. They say there were over 20,000 in New York alone, more than there ever were legal bars before Prohibition. And behind every one, there was a network of men like me, making sure the liquor flowed. Benny loved those places, the lights, the music, the women. He thrived in the chaos. Meyer loved the numbers, the profits stacked higher every week. Me? I loved the control. I loved knowing that if you wanted to drink in my city, you were drinking because I allowed it. But success paints a target on your back. The cops raided places left and right. Rivals tried hijacking shipments. Some nights, bullets flew faster than bottles. I remember one deal where a truckload of whiskey was supposed to make it from Jersey into Manhattan. By the time it hit the bridge, another crew tried to take it. Gunfire in the dark, headlights cutting through smoke, tires screeching on wet pavement. Most men would panic. Me? I stayed calm. I told the driver to keep going, foot on the gas, eyes forward. We made it across with half the bottles broken but our profit intact. That's the difference. Panic loses shipments. Calm keeps the money flowing. And while others fought over scraps, I kept my eyes higher. Rothstein drilled it into me: why fight wars when you can cut deals? Why spill blood when you can shake hands? That's what Prohibition was teaching me. You don't rule the streets by force alone. You rule them by making sure everyone eats just enough to keep them loyal. We started working with crews nobody thought we'd touch. Italians and Jews, Irish and Poles. If they moved liquor, we found a way to move it together. It wasn't about heritage, it was about profit. That was new. That was the future. The old bosses didn't like it, but they were too busy shooting each other to stop us. The public? They didn't care. They were too busy drinking. The rich threw parties in penthouses with champagne flowing like water. The working man downed shots in smoky backrooms after a long shift. Ministers preached temperance by day, then sipped gin by night. Everybody was in on it. Everybody was guilty. And we were laughing all the way to the bank. But Prohibition wasn't just money, it was blood. Too much blood. Gangs fought for territory like wolves. Truck hijackings turned into street massacres. Politicians who couldn't be bought ended up buried. The city was a battlefield, every corner a war zone. And yet, in the middle of it all, I stayed calm. That's what made me different. That's what kept me alive. One night, after a particularly bloody shootout between rival crews, Meyer turned to me and said, "Lucky, this can't last. They're gonna kill each other till there's nothing left." And he was right. The city was eating itself alive. But I knew something he didn't, not yet. I knew that one day, I'd be the one to bring order to the chaos. One day, I'd turn this madness into something organized, something permanent. That seed was planted in the smoke and blood of Prohibition. Because when the law tells the people they can't have what they want, the underworld steps up to give it to them. And when the underworld steps up, somebody's gotta lead it. Somebody calm, steady, smart enough to see the bigger picture. That somebody was me. So when you think about Prohibition, don't just think about speakeasies and jazz. Think about the foundations of an empire. Think about kids from the Lower East Side turning into businessmen in silk suits. Think about midnight shipments across the Hudson, deals whispered in cigar smoke, and a calm voice in the middle of chaos saying, "Keep moving. We're not done yet." Because Prohibition didn't just make us rich. It made us powerful. It turned me from a hustler into a visionary. And once you taste that kind of power, you don't go back. No, you keep climbing. You keep building. And you start planning for the day when the old guard falls and the new order rises. And trust me, that day was coming. Every street kid dreams of a mentor, someone who shows you how the world really works. For me, that man was Arnold Rothstein. The man they called the brain. Luck only takes you so far. Street smarts get you another step. But to build an empire? You need a teacher. You need someone who's already walked the tightrope, balanced greed against danger, and lived to tell about it. For me, that man was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein wasn't like the other gangsters. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to wave a gun around. He had something sharper, a mind. They called him the brain for a reason. He thought 3 moves ahead like a chess master while the rest of the underworld was still figuring out the rules of checkers. The first time I sat across from him, I understood I was in the presence of a different kind of power. He wasn't some street hood in a wrinkled suit. No. Rothstein wore elegance like armor, tailored suits, polished shoes, a cigarette always burning slow between his fingers. He looked more like a Wall Street banker than a criminal. And maybe that was the point. He wasn't just playing the underworld, he was playing the world. He taught me lessons no school would ever dare teach. The first, control yourself before you control others. C, most gangsters back then were slaves to impulse, drink, women, rage. They let their vices pull the strings. Not Rothstein. He treated life like a card game. Keep a straight face, stay calm, never reveal what you're holding. He once told me, Charlie, if they can't read you, they can't beat you. Those words stuck. They became my code. The second lesson, business first, blood second. Back then, most of the Italian bosses still believed respect came from fear, from spilling blood on sidewalks. Rothstein thought different. Money buys more loyalty than violence ever could. Violence is noisy, he'd say, but money whispers forever. That line hit me like scripture. It reshaped the way I looked at power. Why waste soldiers on a street war when you can buy the very streets they're fighting over? Rothstein didn't just make money, he engineered it. He had his hands in everything: real estate, gambling, narcotics, and of course, liquor. But he didn't just gamble with dice or cards, he gambled with people, with entire systems. You ever hear about the 1919 World Series scandal? That was him. He didn't just fix a game. He proved that even America's sacred pastime could be bought. That's the kind of mind he had, the vision to see that everything and everyone had a price. Meyer and I, we hung onto his every word. Benny too, though he was always more about the action than the philosophy. But me? I was a sponge. Rothstein showed me how to launder money through businesses, how to use banks and politicians, how to turn crime into something bigger, organized crime. He gave us the blueprint for what would later become the Commission. But lessons don't come free. Rothstein didn't mentor out of charity. He saw potential in us, sure, but he also saw tools he could sharpen and use. I didn't mind. Because every job, every deal we ran for him was another chapter in the education of Lucky Luciano. He'd send us to negotiate with suppliers, calm down hot-headed crews, or patch up deals on the verge of collapse. Each time, he'd watch from the shadows, judging, grading, teaching. And each time, I kept my cool. That's what impressed him most, not my fists, not my gun, but my ability to stay calm when everyone else was losing their heads. I remember one night a deal for a shipment of scotch nearly went south. Tensions were high, guns practically drawn. Rothstein stood in the back, silent, expressionless. All eyes were on me. My heart was pounding, but my voice? Steady. Calm. I talked them down, found the middle ground, and the deal went through. Afterward, Rothstein pulled me aside. He didn't smile, he rarely did, but he nodded. Just once. That nod was worth more than $1,000. It meant I was passing his test. But here's the thing about mentors, you start out admiring them, and sooner or later, you outgrow them. Rothstein was brilliant, but he wasn't immortal. His world had limits. He still played cards too long, trusted the wrong men, and let debts pile up. In 1928, when they found him dying in that hotel room after a card game gone wrong, the city trembled. To me, it was more than a headline. It was a warning. Even the brain could bleed. Even the smartest man in the room could fall. I learned one last lesson from his death, *, never gamble your empire. *, build it steady, build it strong, but never stake it all on one hand. Rothstein bet big and lost. I swore I'd never make that mistake. To this day, when people ask how I built what I built, I tell them it started with Rothstein's lessons, * stay calm. Think ahead. Use money, not bullets. Play the long game. And most of all, never let anyone know what hand you're holding until it's too late. * Arnold Rothstein may not have lived to see the empire we created. But without him, there would have been no Luciano. No Meyer Lansky. No Benny Siegel. No commission. He was the architect who drew the blueprint. We were just the builders. And me? I was the one who promised myself I'd never end up like him, brilliant but bleeding out in the back room of a hotel, surrounded by debts and whispers. No. I'd take his lessons and go further. Much further. They say New York ain't a city, it's an empire carved into 5 kingdoms. And back then, every kingdom bled for the throne. New York in the late 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield, with skyscrapers for towers and alleys for trenches. The air was thick with ambition, liquor, and the gun smoke of rival crews. Everybody wanted a piece of the pie, but there was only so much pie to go around. Italians, Jews, Irish, even the remnants of the old Black Hand, all of them clawing for control. And at the center of that storm stood a structure that would define organized crime for generations, the 5 families. Now, let me paint you the picture. You had bosses who thought tradition was law, men who still clung to the old ways of Sicily, where bloodline meant more than brains. Joe Masuria, Joe the Boss, was one of those men. Big, loud, gluttonous, running his empire with an iron fist and a belly full of pasta. He believed loyalty was fear and power was measured in corpses. To him, I was just another soldier. Useful, sure, but disposable. Then you had Salvatore Maranzano, the other big name across the river. He was different, quiet, calculating, almost priestly in the way he carried himself. But don't mistake calm for kindness. He believed in structure, in a hierarchy modeled after ancient Rome. In his mind, every soldier was a legionnaire, every captain a centurion, and he was Caesar. The arrogance of it burned through his calm like fire under ice. And caught between these two giants, the old bull Masuria and the would-be Emperor Maranzano, were the rest of us. Young men who didn't care about Sicily, who didn't care about tradition. We cared about opportunity. Me, Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, Frank Costello, we were the next generation. We saw beyond the street corner. We saw a future where business mattered more than blood feuds. But the bosses couldn't see it. They were blind, trapped in their own egos. And so the streets became rivers of blood. They called it the Castellamarese War. A war where bullets wrote history and funerals became weekly processions. Every corner store was a battlefield, every barbershop a potential execution site. It was a war of whispers and ambushes, a chessboard soaked in red. I'll never forget the night I stood over the city from the Williamsburg Bridge, watching the lights flicker across the East River. Down there, in the shadows, crews were hunting each other, brothers killing brothers, soldiers betraying captains, all for scraps. And I asked myself, is this the future? Endless blood for nothing? That's when I knew something had to change. But change doesn't come cheap. And it doesn't come without blood of its own. See, I played both sides. Outwardly, I stayed loyal to Joe Masuria. He was my boss, after all. But secretly, I was already planning his end. I could see the writing on the wall. Masuria was too old, too stubborn. He'd never adapt, never let the younger bloods reshape the business. If we stuck with him, we'd drown in the past. And I had no interest in drowning. So I made a deal with the devil, or maybe with destiny. I reached out to Maranzano. Quietly. Carefully. He promised me a seat at the new table if I helped remove Joe the boss from the game. It wasn't a decision made in haste, it was survival. The kind of survival that would rewrite the underworld forever. But let's not skip ahead. Because before the knives came out, the war dragged on. Crews switched sides like gamblers changing tables. Friends one night, enemies the next. Even cops and politicians weren't safe from the reach of this war. Many found themselves on payrolls, others in coffins. It was chaos, pure and simple. And in chaos, only the calm survive. Meyer used to tell me, Charlie, don't get lost in the noise. Look for the silence. He was right. While the bosses shouted and soldiers killed, we listened. We watched. We planned. And slowly, piece by piece, we built a vision of something greater. What if, instead of endless wars, there was order? What if the city wasn't split by ego, but by structure? Instead of one Caesar lording over everyone, what if there were families, 5 of them balanced, organized, each with its own territory but bound by rules? That idea took root in my head like a seed in good soil. And from that seed, an empire would grow. But first, the old guard had to fall. The war was grinding down by 1931, but every day carried risk. You'd wake up not knowing if a bullet was waiting outside your front door. I kept my composure, always. Never let them see me sweat. That's what Rothstein's lessons gave me, calm in the middle of the storm. While others ran on fear, I ran on focus. And when the moment finally came, when the trap for Masuria was set in that little Coney Island restaurant, I didn't hesitate. It was brutal, yes, but necessary. The old ways had to die for the new ways to live. After Joe the boss was gone, Maranzano thought he was king. He strutted like Caesar, handed out titles, reorganized the gangs into what he called families. 5 families, each with a boss, underboss, and captains. For a moment, it looked like order had been born out of chaos. But make no mistake, Maranzano didn't want balance. He wanted empire. And I had no interest in being another man's soldier forever. I'd already seen too much, learned too much. The 5 families were born in blood, but they wouldn't truly live until I made my move. Until I reshaped them not as Maranzano's empire, but as something new. Something lasting. Something bigger than any one man. That's how power works. First you inherit the rules, then you break them. And soon enough, New York would learn that Lucky Luciano wasn't built to follow. I was built to lead. They called him Caesar, but in New York, even Caesars bleed. And the day Salvatore Maranzano crowned himself emperor, he signed his own death warrant. Power is a funny thing. It doesn't whisper, it shouts. And Maranzano? He was shouting louder than anyone in the city. After Masuria fell in 1931, the streets buzzed with rumors, whispers of a new order. Salvatore Maranzano stepped into the light, dressed sharp, speaking smoother than the priests on Sunday. To the press, he was just another Italian businessman with connections. But inside the underworld, we knew the truth: he wasn't just another boss. He wanted it all. Maranzano believed he was building a Roman Empire in the heart of New York. He didn't call them gangs anymore, he called them families. He set 5 thrones across the city, each with a boss, underboss, and captains beneath them. It sounded revolutionary, and to a degree, it was. For the first time, the chaos of endless wars had a skeleton, a structure. But Maranzano didn't stop at structure. No, he wanted absolute rule. He crowned himself boss of bosses. The asterisk capo di tutti capi. Asterisk Caesar of the streets. And for a little while, it worked. The older men bent their knees, the soldiers kissed his ring, and the city quieted. But power breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds mistakes. At first, I played along. I nodded when he spoke of Rome. I shook his hand, let him call me his trusted man. But inside, I was calculating. Because here's the thing about Caesar: he never trusts Brutus. Maranzano watched me too closely. He knew I was young, ambitious, already a legend among the new blood. He liked me, sure, but he didn't trust me. And in this business, distrust is a death sentence sooner or later. I'll never forget one of our meetings in his office downtown. He had maps of New York spread across the desk, pins marking territories like a general preparing for war. He leaned in, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. Asterisk Charlie, loyalty is everything. The moment you start thinking bigger than your station, you're already dead. Asterisk that was Maranzano, smiling, but always reminding you where the knife could go. The whispers reached me soon enough. He was planning to take me out: me, Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, maybe even Frank Costello. One by one, he wanted the younger generation erased. His empire had no room for visionaries. Only followers. But I wasn't about to play the role of victim. This was the moment Meyer's lessons about silence came back to me. While Maranzano strutted like Caesar, we moved like shadows. We talked to the right people, passed the right envelopes, bought the right loyalty. And then we called in something the old Italians never saw coming: outsiders. Not Sicilians. Not Italians at all. We turned to Jewish hitmen, the kind of men Maranzano's people would never recognize, never expect. It was brilliant in its simplicity: he was too blind, too arrogant to imagine assassins who didn't fit the mold. The plan was set. Maranzano would die in his own office, a Caesar cut down not by rivals at the table, but by strangers with guns and blades. It was almost poetic. The morning of the hit, New York looked the same as it always did: hustle in the streets, vendors calling, trains rattling overhead. But for me, the city had a hum, a vibration in the air. Every noise sounded sharper. Every step felt heavier. Because this wasn't just another murder. This was history. Maranzano was in his office at the Helmsley Building, just another day playing emperor. The assassins walked in like businessmen, suits pressed, faces calm. No one questioned them. That was the beauty of it. They weren't from his world. They didn't carry the smell of Sicilian vendettas on their coats. When the door closed behind them, Caesar's empire ended. The story goes like this: they pulled their guns, pinned him down. Some say he begged. Others say he cursed. Either way, it didn't matter. They shot him, stabbed him, left him broken on the floor of the office he thought was his throne room. From Caesar to corpse in a matter of minutes. News spread like wildfire. The streets whispered, asterisk Maranzano's dead. Asterisk the old men panicked, the young men smirked, and New York shifted beneath our feet. For the first time, there was no boss of bosses. Just a vacuum, wide open, waiting to be filled. And I stepped forward. Not as another Caesar. Not as another tyrant. But as something different. See, I'd learned from both Masuria and Maranzano. From Joe, I learned what happens when you cling to the past. From Salvatore, I learned what happens when you grab too much. Both of them died for their mistakes. And me? I wasn't about to make the same ones. That night, I sat with Meyer, Benny, and Costello. We didn't toast. Didn't celebrate. This wasn't about joy. This was about the future. No more emperors, I told them. Asterisk, no more boss of bosses. From now on, we're equals. A commission. A table, not a throne. Asterisk, Meyer lit a cigarette, eyes glowing in the smoke. Asterisk, it'll work, Charlie. Balance. Order. They won't know what hit M. Asterisk, and he was right. Maranzano's fall wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. The old world had been buried. In its place, a new underworld would rise, one built on rules, on balance, on business. My world. But don't think for a second it was clean. Blood was always the currency. Fear was always the language. And I knew, deep down, the day would come when someone would look at me the way I looked at Maranzano, like a king too dangerous to live. But that was tomorrow's problem. For now, Caesar was dead. And Lucky Luciano had just become the most powerful man in New York. And the streets? They fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't silence born of fear. It was silence born of respect. What's stronger than a throne? A table. And on that table, I built something the mob had never seen before, a government of gangsters, a democracy of killers. When Maranzano hit the floor of his office in 1931, bleeding out like a Caesar cut down by shadows, the underworld cracked wide open. The old men were terrified. The younger ones, me, Meyer, Benny, Costello, we weren't celebrating, but we knew this was the moment. A vacuum had formed, and nature hates a vacuum. Someone had to step in, but this time it couldn't be another boss of bosses. That title was cursed. Masuria wore it, he died. Maranzano wore it, he died quicker. I wasn't about to be the third fool in line. Instead, I wanted something smarter. Something that didn't scream dictator but whispered stability. That's when the idea came. Not a throne, a table. Not one voice, but many. The commission. It was bold, maybe even crazy, but I knew it would work. See, every gangland war started the same way, one boss grabbing too much, another boss fighting back, blood in the streets, widows in black dresses. It was endless, it was stupid, and worst of all, it was bad for business. And if I was anything, I was a businessman. I gathered the men I trusted most first. Meyer Lansky, the brains with ice in his veins. Benny Bugsy Siegel, wild but loyal, like a wolf. Frank Costello, smooth as a politician, a man who could talk his way into any room and leave with half the room in his pocket. These were my pillars. Together, we laid the foundation for something bigger than all of us. The plan was simple on paper, dangerous in reality. Every major family boss in the country would have a seat at the table. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, you name it. No one boss above another, no boss of bosses nonsense. Instead, we'd vote. We'd meet. We'd solve disputes without bullets flying. Like senators in a twisted underworld Congress. The first test, Chicago. Al Capone had just been hauled off to prison on tax charges, but his shadow still loomed large. His successor, Frank Nitti, was running things, but everyone knew Chicago was Capone's town. I sent word, join us, and you'll never have another St. Valentine's Day massacre. Resist us, and you'll end up with 10. They joined. Detroit followed. Then Cleveland. Then the rest. Piece by piece, the table was set. For New York, I divided the city into 5 families, each with power, each with a boss, but none with more power than the others. Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Lucchese, Colombo, names that would echo for decades. At the time, they were just men at my table, eating bread and drinking wine while carving up the future. The first commission meeting was electric. We met in a quiet backroom, guarded on all sides, the air thick with cigar smoke and suspicion. Around the table sat killers, smugglers, racketeers, men who'd ordered dozens of murders without blinking an eye. And yet that night, they looked like nervous schoolboys waiting for the teacher to speak. I let the silence stretch, long and heavy. Then I spoke. Gentlemen, the old way is dead. Boss of bosses? Finished. That title belongs in the grave with Maranzano. From this day forward, we rule together. We vote together. Disputes come here, not to the streets. Anyone breaks the peace, they answer to all of us. Some nodded. Some smirked. Some looked like they wanted to spit in my face. But they listened. That was the key. Meyer, ever the strategist, backed me up. Think about it. Less blood means more money. More money means more power. It's not about pride. It's about profit. He spoke calm, logical, and every man at that table knew he was right. One by one, they agreed. It wasn't unanimous, nothing ever is, but it was enough. The commission was born. It felt historic, and it was. For the first time, organized crime in America had rules, structure, order. Not the kind Maranzano dreamed of, built on fear and Caesar worship, but one built on balance. The families became like states, and the commission was the Congress. And me? I was its architect. But don't get it twisted. This wasn't peace, not really. It was controlled chaos. Like keeping a pack of wolves in a pen. They'd still snap and bite, but the pen kept them from tearing each other to pieces. And if one wolf got too wild? The others turned on him quick. That's how we handled disputes. No more street wars. Instead, a boss crossed the line, the commission voted, and justice came swift. Sometimes justice was exile. Sometimes it was bullets in the night. Either way, the message was clear, the commission was law. I remember leaving that first meeting, the city alive outside, and thinking, we did it. We turned crime into government. It was surreal. And dangerous. Because governments fall. They always do. The press never knew the truth, not then. To them, gangsters were still just wild dogs shooting each other in alleys. They didn't see the parliament of criminals meeting in quiet rooms, smoking cigars, deciding who lived and who died. But the men who mattered? They knew. Word spread fast in the underworld. Luciano had pulled off the impossible. He'd made peace by making everyone a king. Of course, kings are never truly equal. Some have bigger armies. Some have sharper swords. And though I told them I wasn't boss of bosses, they all knew I was the man who pulled the strings. Respect, fear, loyalty, it all flowed my way. Not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. That was the trick. Let them think they're equals. Let them think they're free. Meanwhile, every decision, every deal somehow lined up with what I wanted. That's not dictatorship. That's mastery. But with power comes weight. I knew it wouldn't last forever. The feds were sniffing around. Politicians were restless. Reformers were shouting in the papers. And worst of all, within the families, ambition never sleeps. Someone would always want my chair, my influence, my power. For now, though, the streets were quiet. The machine was running smooth. Money flowed like wine. Gambling, bootlegging, labor rackets, it all moved with efficiency. For the first time, the mob looked less like a gang and more like a corporation. And me? I was the CEO of crime. At night, when the city calmed, I'd sit back with a drink and think about it all. How a kid from the Lower East Side, once just another street punk, now sat at the head of an invisible empire. No thrones. No crowns. Just a table. But that table was stronger than any throne. The commission wasn't just an invention. It was survival. It was legacy. And it was the beginning of an empire that would last decades, long after my own name would fade into legend. But every empire has cracks. Every table eventually wobbles. And I knew, deep down, the commission would one day face its own betrayal, its own downfall. Not tonight, though. Tonight, the kings had eaten, drunk, and shaken hands. And the city, for once, slept without the sound of gunfire. A desert looks empty to most men. Sand, heat, silence. But to us? That emptiness looked like opportunity, a gold mine just waiting for a shovel. The commission gave us stability, order, rules that kept blood off the sidewalks. But stability is only good if it feeds the hunger for more. Men like us, we never stopped chasing the next score. New York was ours. Chicago was with us. The unions, the docks, the bootlegging, we had it all. But Meyer said it best one night, sipping whiskey slow, Charlie, if we stop moving, we die. That's when the desert came calling. Las Vegas. Back then, it wasn't neon lights, fountains, and skyscraper casinos. It was dust, cactus, rattlesnakes, a railroad stop in Nevada that most men drove past without looking twice. But to us, it had two things that mattered more than anything: gambling was legal, and law was weak. No bishops wagging fingers, no reformers pounding on pulpits. Just wide open land and silence. Silence we could fill with noise, music, dice, women, and money. The man who saw it clearest was Benny Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy was always half genius, half lunatic. He could charm a movie star in the afternoon and gun down a rival at midnight. Hollywood loved him. The women loved him more. But underneath the charm, Benny wanted more than rackets and nightclubs. He wanted a monument, something that would put his name in lights forever. Vegas gave him the canvas. It started small. Meyer and I saw gambling in Nevada as just another racket. Some small-time joints, some skim off the top, nothing too loud. But Benny? He came back from a trip to the desert with a fire in his eyes. Charlie, Meyer, he said, waving his hands like a mad prophet, we can build a palace out there. Not just a joint with dice, but a palace. A resort. Gambling, women, shows, food make it bigger than life. They'll come from everywhere to see it. At first, I thought he'd lost it. A palace in the desert? Who the hell would drive out into the middle of nowhere just to roll dice? But Benny believed, and belief is contagious. He painted pictures with words, grand lobbies, chandeliers, tuxedos, the kind of glamour that could turn crime into high society. We gave him the green light. Money flowed in from every corner: Meyer, myself, even the Chicago boys. Millions poured into the sand. The project was called the Flamingo. But building in the desert ain't like building in Brooklyn. The sun burned through men's backs. Supplies vanished. Contractors skimmed half, and Benny, God bless him, skimmed the rest. The costs doubled, then tripled. What was supposed to be a clean investment turned into a hole swallowing cash like quicksand. Meyer kept the books. He warned me. Charlie, Benny's bleeding us dry. He's throwing money at this thing like it's water. Chandeliers from France, marble from Italy, silk drapes from God knows where. It's not a casino anymore, it's Versailles in the sand. I knew he was right. But Benny was family. He'd killed for me, bled for me. Loyalty meant something. So I told Meyer, give him rope. Let's see if he climbs or hangs himself. When the Flamingo finally opened in December 1946, it wasn't just a building, it was a mirage come to life. Neon lights lit up the desert like daylight. Inside, everything screamed luxury. Showgirls with legs for miles, bands that played all night, dealers in tuxedos. It was Hollywood, but real. A palace of chance. But the night it opened? Disaster. The place was half finished. Dust in the corners. Plaster still wet. High rollers stayed away, scared off by whispers of mob money and construction mess. The few who came lost big and left angry. Instead of crowds, there were empty chairs and echoes. Benny was furious as pacing the lobby, swearing that the crowds would come. They didn't. Not at first. The losses piled up, hundreds of thousands gone in weeks. The commission started grumbling. Chicago wanted blood. Seagulls stealing. Seagulls stalling. Seagulls sinking us, they said. Meyer defended him. I defended him. But in this life, patience is a rare currency. And Benny was running out of it. By 47, the Flamingo started to pick up. Tourists trickled in, the shows gained fame, the tables finally rang with coins. Benny wasn't wrong, Vegas could be the gold mine he promised. But by then, it was too late. The bosses didn't care about potential. They cared about the millions already lost. They wanted a head on a platter. I got the call. Chicago said flat out, Benny's done. That night, I sat alone, a drink in my hand, thinking about the kid I'd brought up from the Lower East Side. Wild, fearless, loyal, Bugsy. He dreamed too big, spent too fast, but he was one of us. And yet, I knew the rules. The commission doesn't forgive bleeding the family dry, even if the dream comes true later. June 20, 1947. Beverly Hills. Benny sat on a couch reading a paper, maybe dreaming about the crowds that would one day flood the Flamingo. A rifle poked through the window. One squeeze. One bullet through the eye. Bugsy Siegel was gone. The papers called it shocking, brutal, a Hollywood ending for a Hollywood gangster. But in our world? It was business. Cold, necessary business. The next day, Meyer and I made sure Vegas didn't die with Benny. We sent men to the Flamingo, cleaned house, tightened the books. And slowly, it turned. The money came. The crowds came. Vegas rose from the sand like a glittering empire. That's the irony, Benny's dream was real. He saw it before anyone. He was right. But he never lived to enjoy it. Vegas became the mob's golden goose, a cash river that flowed for decades. Casinos sprouted like weeds, each one a palace, each one a front, each one feeding the commission. When I close my eyes, I still see him, Bugsy, pacing with that fire in his eyes, saying, Charlie, they'll come. They'll come in droves. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't live long enough to hear the roar of the crowd. Vegas was more than a racket. It was immortality. The mob turned a desert into a dream, a wasteland into a wonderland. And it all started with a wild kid from Brooklyn who wanted his name in lights. And though Benny's name faded, Vegas kept shining. Neon never forgets. Before the revolution, Havana wasn't just a city. It was a playground, our playground. Sun, rum, women, dice, and politicians, all for sale. A paradise where the rules bent as easily as the palm trees in the wind. By the late 1940s, New York was ours. Chicago stood with us. Vegas was beginning to rise, neon sprouting from sand. But Meyer and I, we were never satisfied with one throne. We wanted an empire that reached beyond borders, beyond oceans. And if Vegas was the desert dream, then Havana was the tropical paradise. Cuba wasn't America. That meant no meddling governors, no self-righteous crusaders with badges and cameras. What it had instead was Fulgencio Batista, a president with one hand in politics and the other wide open for cash. Batista didn't care if you ran dice, girls, or casinos. He cared about the envelopes thick with dollars, delivered on time. That was music to our ears. Meyer saw it first. Always the visionary, he whispered to me one night, Charlie, Havana could be bigger than Vegas. Americans want sin with sunshine. They'll come for the beaches, but they'll stay for the tables. We can give them both. It made sense. Cuba was only 90 miles from Florida, close enough for the rich to fly in on a Friday and back home on Monday. And the tourists came, Hollywood stars, Wall Street sharks, politicians who wanted to taste sin without anyone watching. The city was alive, nightclubs pulsing with mambo, bars overflowing with rum, the air hot and thick with smoke, perfume, and money. We weren't the only ones who saw the opportunity. Santo Traficante Jr. from Tampa had his hooks in Havana long before us, running clubs and rackets like a king. But Santo was a businessman, not a fool. He welcomed Meyer and me because he knew together we could turn Havana from a playground into a kingdom. We built palaces. The Nacional, the Capri, the Tropicana casinos dressed like movie sets, dripping with chandeliers, velvet, and marble. Showgirls with feathers danced under spotlights while tuxedo dealers spun roulette wheels. Outside, the streets hummed with Chevrolets, cabaret music, and the shuffle of tourists looking for sin in the Caribbean night. And oh, the money! The tables never slept. Blackjack, roulette, baccarat, they sang all night, and the house always won. Skimmed cash stuffed into suitcases left Havana quietly, flown back into the hands of the commission. Millions, clean as sunshine. But Havana wasn't just about the dice. It was a buffet of every vice a man could crave. The hotels had brothels on their top floors, women from every corner of the world. Drugs flowed like rivers, morphine, heroin, cocaine. Politicians dined with gangsters, cops guarded our doors, and Batista kept smiling, his pockets fat. He was our man, and we were his bankers. It was so good, so perfect, that even I began to believe it would last forever. By 1946, Meyer wanted to make it official. He called together the Great Havana Conference. Every boss, every name from New York to Chicago to Tampa, men who ran the underworld, sat together under Cuban chandeliers, sipping rum like kings. We weren't hiding anymore. We were planning an empire, and Havana was the jewel in the crown. I remember that conference like it was yesterday. Frank Costello was there, calm and smooth. Joe Adonis too, always with his sly smile. Even Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatchet, showed his face. But the real eyes were on one man, me, Lucky Luciano. I had been deported from America. Italy thought they'd chained me, kept me exiled far from the streets I built. But that night in Havana, I sat at the head of the table, cigars lit, glasses clinking. I was still the boss of bosses, still the man pulling the strings even from exile. Meyer gave a speech, calm but sharp, laying out the plan. Havana would be ours, the hub for gambling, drugs, and money laundering. Batista would play ball. Santo would manage the streets. And the commission would feed off the riches, steady as clockwork. But power always draws attention. And attention is poison. The U.S. government caught wind. Newspapers screamed about Luciano in Havana, about gangsters living like kings under the Cuban sun. Washington leaned on Batista hard. The pressure grew. The spotlight burned. Within weeks, Batista caved. The police stormed my suite, dragged me out, and shipped me back to Italy. The paradise I'd built slipped from my fingers, just like that. Still, Meyer stayed. Havana was too rich to abandon. Through the 1950s, the money kept flowing. Vegas grew, yes, but Havana glittered hotter. Tourists said it was Sin City with palm trees. The mob said it was the safest investment we ever had. But paradise has a way of rotting from the inside. The rot came in the form of a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro. At first, he was just a whisper, a nuisance in the mountains. Batista laughed him off. But whispers grew into gunfire, gunfire into armies, armies into revolution. By 1958, Havana was trembling. Batista grew desperate, greedy, squeezing every dollar he could before the end. Tourists stopped coming. Casinos started emptying. And we felt the ground shifting beneath us. The party was ending. Then came January 1, 1959. Batista fled the island in the dead of night, stuffing his pockets with the last of our money. By morning, Castro's men rolled into Havana on tanks, waving flags, shooting rifles in the air. The people cheered. The new Cuba had arrived. For us, it was over. Castro wasn't Batista. He didn't care about envelopes. He didn't bend. He slammed the doors shut on our casinos, seized the hotels, kicked out the bosses. In one stroke, the golden goose was slaughtered. Billions vanished into smoke. I remember Meyer's face when he told me. He was older then, tired, his voice softer. Charlie, it's gone. Havana's gone. All the years, all the work, it's ashes now. He was right. Havana, our paradise, was lost. And yet, even in that loss, there was a kind of poetry. Havana had been too good, too loud, too perfect. No paradise lasts forever, not for men like us. The dice always stop rolling. The music always fades. We built an empire in the tropics. Palaces of sin under the Cuban sun. For a while, it felt eternal. But nothing in this life is eternal, not power, not paradise, not even the commission. Havana taught us that. It taught us that every empire has its end, even when it's wrapped in silken sunshine. For years, we lived in the shadows, untouchable, invisible, whispers in the wind. But one afternoon, in a sleepy little town in upstate New York, the whole world saw us. One mistake, one unlucky break, and the American Mafia was dragged into the daylight. By the mid-1950s, our empire stretched like a spider's web across America. New York was the heartbeat. Chicago the muscle. Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, all loyal nodes on the map. Vegas glittered in the desert. Havana was slipping away, but we were still flush with cash. And through it all, the commission ruled silently, steady as a hidden government. We had one rule above all: never be seen. Let the world believe we didn't exist. To the papers, the courts, the cops, we were myths, rumors, shadows. Men disappeared, fortunes shifted, streets obeyed us, but to the public there was no mafia. Then came 1957. Vito Genovese, hungry and ambitious, wanted more than shadows. He wanted the crown. Since I'd been exiled, he'd been clawing for power, scheming to take my seat, to become capo di tutti capi in everything but name. The commission was supposed to prevent kings, but Vito never played by the rules. So he called a meeting. Not just any meeting, the biggest the mafia had ever seen. Appalachian, New York. Out in the countryside. Quiet. Safe. Surrounded by fields and trees. On paper, it made sense. Away from the city, away from the eyes. They gathered at the estate of Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara, a boss from upstate who owned a sprawling property. Dozens of Cadillacs and Lincolns rolled up the dirt roads that autumn afternoon. Inside that house, under one roof, sat the entire American underworld: bosses, underbosses, capos from every corner of the country. It was like the United Nations of crime. New York families. Chicago outfit. Buffalo. Tampa. New Orleans, all there. The purpose was clear: to recognize Vito Genovese as the new power, to solidify narcotics routes, to divide the spoils of Havana before Castro closed the doors for good. It should have been flawless. But pride is a dangerous thing. The trouble started with the cars. So many shiny, expensive machines parked on country roads, they stood out like diamonds in dirt. Neighbors noticed. A state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed too. He was a sharp one, not the kind to look away. Suspicious, he drove past Barbara's estate, saw the suits, the cars, the guards. Something wasn't right. Within hours, Croswell had backup. Local cops set up roadblocks. And when word reached the men inside, panic spread like wildfire. Imagine it: America's most powerful gangsters, men who ordered murders with a nod, who controlled cities like kings, sprinting through the woods in tailored suits, tripping over roots, mud on their shiny shoes, running like frightened schoolboys. Some leapt fences. Some dove into bushes. Some abandoned their cars on the roads. It was chaos, humiliating chaos. Dozens were caught. Not for murder, not for racketeering, not for extortion. None caught for gathering, for existing, for proving what we always denied, that the mafia was real, organized, and national. The headlines the next morning screamed across America: * mafia leaders caught in upstate meeting. * the myth was dead. The shadows were gone. Suddenly, Congress, the FBI, the press, all of them knew. We weren't whispers anymore. We were a fact. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's Iron Peacock, had spent years denying our existence. He said organized crime was an illusion, a tabloid fantasy. Appalachian made him a liar. It embarrassed him, forced him to build new units, wiretap our phones, chase our shadows with real resources. The noose began to tighten. Inside the commission, the fallout was worse. Blame flew like bullets. Men whispered, * who planned this? Who exposed us? Who was sloppy enough to let it happen? * fingers pointed at Vito Genovese. He had called the meeting, insisted on the show of strength, demanded recognition. And now, because of his arrogance, the commission was exposed. Meyer told me later, with that dry smile of his, * Charlie, we used to be invisible. Now every two-bit reporter wants to print our names. Vito made us famous, and fame is death in this business. * he was right. The meeting cracked the illusion we had built for decades. And once the world believed in the mafia, the hunt never stopped. Appalachian was the beginning of the end for many. For Vito, the curse came fast. Within 2 years, he was pinched on narcotics charges. Some said it was bad luck. Others whispered it was payback, a setup by rivals who wanted him buried for what he'd done in Appalachian. Either way, the great Genovese spent the rest of his life rotting in a cell, his empire crumbling. But the damage was already done. Appalachian taught us that secrecy wasn't just smart, it was survival. It forced the families to scatter, to keep their heads down, to stop gathering in numbers that could be counted by cops with binoculars. Never again would bosses from coast to coast sit in one room. The risk was too great. Still, I can't help but laugh at the irony. For decades, we killed to stay invisible, bribed to stay untouchable, bled to keep the public blind. And in the end, what destroyed our invisibility wasn't a bullet or a betrayal, but a simple traffic cop in upstate New York doing his job. One man. One pair of watchful eyes tore the veil away. That's the curse of power. You grow too large, too proud, too bold, and the world starts to see you. Appalachian was proof. It was the day the shadows failed us, the day the commission stood naked under the sun. They call it the Appalachian meeting, but we remember it as the day the curtain was pulled. The bosses ran like deer, the papers printed our names, and America finally saw us. From that day on, the mafia was no longer a ghost. We were real. And reality is always harder to survive than myth. They say every king falls. Some go down in blood, others in chains. Me? I fell in whispers, in shadows, in exile, still feared, still respected, but far from the streets I once ruled. This is the part of the story they don't tell you, the quiet fall of Lucky Luciano. By the time the 1960s dawned, I was no longer the man walking Mulberry Street with a razor in my pocket and fire in my chest. I was older, worn down, still sharp, but my empire wasn't in my hands anymore. America had moved on without me, though every corner of that underworld still bore my fingerprints. Exile in Italy was supposed to be punishment, a slow death away from the city that made me. But truth is, I adapted. I always did. Naples became my stage, my balcony view of the new world. The streets there were different, slower, poorer, haunted by war. But even in exile, men came to me, soldiers, emissaries, young toughs hungry for advice. I was a king without a throne, a teacher of shadows. But make no mistake, I never stopped watching New York. Through whispers, letters, loyal messengers, I heard it all. Genovese rotting in prison after Apalachin. Carlo Gambino rising like a phantom, calm and clever. The commission shifting, reshaping, hardening under the FBI's new pressure. The game was changing, and though I wasn't on the board anymore, I still understood every move. I spent my days half in reflection, half in paranoia. My health was fading, heart trouble, old wounds catching up, the wear and tear of too many years under the strain of power. Yet the old habits never left. I kept my suits pressed, my shoes polished, my hair combed back like it was still 1931. Even in exile, you never stop being lucky. There were whispers of me returning, always whispers. Some said I would rise again, take back what was mine, rebuild a seat at the commission table. Others said I was finished, a ghost haunting hotel rooms and seaside promenades. Maybe both were true. Then came 1962. Havana was lost to Castro, and with it, one of our richest dreams. But in the shadows, narcotics were exploding, a trade as dangerous as it was profitable. And my name kept getting tied to it. Smugglers, middlemen, couriers, they all claimed ties to Lucky Luciano. Whether I truly pulled the strings or not didn't matter. To the authorities, to the press, Lucky was still the face of the Mafia's darkest trades. The truth? By then, I wasn't the man with his hands on the wheel. I advised. I blessed. I whispered. But the streets were run by others, men I had once groomed, men who used my name as currency. To them, I was still the boss in spirit, the old lion whose shadow stretched long. And yet my greatest battles were no longer fought in alleys or commission rooms. They were fought in my own chest. My heart, that old enemy, was giving out. Doctors told me to slow down, to rest, to live quietly. But men like me don't fade gently. We live fast. We scheme till the end. We gamble with the last chips we have. In January 1962, I was in Naples, waiting for a meeting. Not with killers, not with capos, but with a Hollywood producer. Imagine that, the man who built the commission, who carved an empire out of blood and bootleg, now sitting down to talk about movies. They wanted to make a picture about my life, to immortalize me in film. Part of me laughed at the irony. I had spent my life fighting to stay in the shadows, denying the Mafia existed, keeping our faces out of the papers. And now here I was, ready to sell the story, to turn my sins into celluloid. Maybe it was vanity. Maybe it was one last way to control the legend, to make sure the world remembered Lucky on my terms. But fate had other plans. The meeting ended, the deals were whispered, promises made. I stepped outside into the Naples air, a cigarette lit between my fingers. My chest tightened. Not the slow ache I'd known before, this was different. Sharp. Heavy. Final. I collapsed right there on the steps of an airport terminal, the smoke curling up from my lips as if mocking me. January 26, 1962. That was the day Lucky Luciano died. Not with bullets. Not with betrayal. But with a heart that had carried too much for too long. They buried me back in America, after all. Thousands lined the streets of Naples when I died, but in the end, it was New York that claimed me. In Queens, at St. John's Cemetery, I was laid to rest among the very men who had fought beside me and against me. My funeral drew crowds bigger than most politicians. They whispered, they stared, they remembered. Because no matter what exile tried to strip from me, I remained a name carved into the foundation of that world. And what of my legacy? Some call me a visionary, the man who modernized the Mafia, who replaced the chaos of the old Sicilian ways with the structure of the commission, who turned gangs into a syndicate. Others call me a devil, a parasite who fed on fear and greed, who poisoned neighborhoods and left a trail of bodies. Both are true. I was order and chaos. I was Lucky Luciano. In the years after my death, the Mafia would keep changing. Carlo Gambino would rise to near royalty, quiet and calculating. The FBI would hunt harder. The trials would grow louder. The streets would bleed heavier. But every family, every racket, every whispered deal in midnight diners, they all still carried a piece of me. Because I wasn't just a man. I was the blueprint. I was the proof that one immigrant kid from the Lower East Side could bend the world to his will, build a kingdom out of crime, and leave a shadow so long it outlived him. And that's the truth of it. Power fades. Empires crumble. But legends, they stick. Even now, decades later, they still speak my name in hushed tones. They make shows, movies, books, always circling back to Lucky. Not because I was the biggest killer or the richest gangster. But because I changed the game. And I knew how to smile while I did it. So here I leave you, in the silence after the story, the kid with scars on his face, the boss who never stopped calculating, the exile who still cast a shadow. I fell, yes, but even in falling, I made sure the world would never forget me. That's the final trick. The last gamble. The only true immortality a gangster can have. When Lucky Luciano died, many thought an era was over. But the truth is, his shadow never left. The commission still whispered his rules. The bosses still followed his blueprint. The man was gone, but the world he built kept breathing, bleeding, and evolving. The death of Charles Lucky Luciano in 1962 wasn't the end of the mafia, it was the beginning of its second life. The man who once united rival gangs into a syndicate, who drafted the commission as the underworld's constitution, had left behind more than just memories. He left behind a structure so durable, so cunning, that even law enforcement, politicians, and rival criminals had to acknowledge it. In the days following his burial, New York buzzed. Reporters filled columns with his name. Television anchors spoke about him with a mix of awe and dread. FBI agents whispered about the monster who had slipped through their fingers for decades. They said Luciano's passing closed a chapter. What they didn't realize was that the next chapter had already been written by him. The commission still stood a roundtable of 5 families, their reach stretching far beyond New York. The men who now sat at that table, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and others, owed much of their power to Lucky's design. He had built a system where no one man could become Caesar without consequence, where the families balanced power like weights on a scale. Yet human ambition, greed, and betrayal don't vanish with rules. They merely find new cracks to slip through. In the years after Luciano's death, the mafia grew even more entwined with America's bloodstream. The heroin pipeline swelled, smuggling through Sicily and Marseille before spilling into Harlem and Brooklyn. Some whispered that this too was part of Lucky's vision, the final empire he had blessed from exile. Whether true or not, his name remained attached to it. To the FBI, to the DEA, Lucky Luciano was still pulling strings from the grave. But the truth was more complicated. The mafia of the 1960s and 70s was a machine running on his blueprint, but steered by new hands. Carlo Gambino, with his soft-spoken demeanor and iron discipline, became the quiet king of New York. Unlike the flamboyant bosses of old, Gambino ruled from the shadows, rarely photographed, rarely overheard, his empire built on silence. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of Luciano's teachings: control, calculation, invisibility. Meanwhile, the other families wrestled with ambition. Joe Bonanno dreamed of a personal monarchy, nearly sparking a war that could have torn the commission apart. Genovese, rotting in prison but still feared, tried to exert power through surrogates. And always in the background, Lucky's ghost lingered, the reminder that even the strongest boss could be toppled, that unity was the only true shield against chaos. Law enforcement, too, had changed. The FBI, once hesitant to admit the mafia even existed, now launched full-scale crusades against it. Wiretaps. Undercover agents. Informants. The walls were closing in. And yet, despite the pressure, the mafia thrived. Slipping through cracks in the system. Bribing judges. Infiltrating unions. Moving billions through casinos, construction, drugs, and loan sharking. Across the ocean, Luciano's exile left ripples as well. The Sicilian Mafia, long older than its American cousin, studied the commission model and began restructuring its own operations. Old World dons admired Lucky's genius, adopting his balance of tradition and pragmatism. And so, even in death, his ideas migrated, shaping not just New York but Palermo, Rome, Naples, a transatlantic shadow. By the 1970s, the Mafia's empire stretched from the docks of New York to the casinos of Las Vegas, from heroin labs in Europe to neighborhoods in Chicago and Miami. Politicians still denied its power, but anyone who lived in those streets knew the truth. Every deal, every contract, every shipment carried the weight of an invisible tax, the Mafia tax. Luciano's tax. But history doesn't stand still. As the decades passed, cracks widened. The very commission Luciano built to prevent wars began to show strain. Ambitious bosses like John Gotti rejected subtlety, parading their wealth and violence in front of cameras. Federal laws grew sharper: RICO, witness protection, long prison sentences that turned soldiers into informants. The game was shifting, and though Lucky's design held for a time, it was never meant to withstand the full force of the modern state. Still, his ghost endured. Whenever a new boss rose, his name was invoked. Whenever lawmen described the Mafia's structure, they traced it back to him. Television series, books, films all circled back to Lucky Luciano, painting him as the architect of organized crime. Some depicted him as a visionary genius, others as a ruthless predator. Both were true. And what of his personal legacy? That depends on who you ask. To the men who served under him, he was the greatest mind the Mafia ever produced, a leader who thought 3 moves ahead, who gave order to chaos. To the families of his victims, he was nothing but a monster, another gangster who built his empire on blood. To the historians, he was a paradox, a man who claimed to despise violence but orchestrated murders, who sought order but thrived on corruption, who denied the Mafia's existence while shaping it into an empire. Perhaps that's the truest reflection of Lucky Luciano, that he was both things at once. A creator and destroyer. A man who built a kingdom out of shadows, knowing full well it could never last forever, but also knowing that as long as men craved power, money, and respect, his design would outlive him. Even today, decades after his heart gave out in Naples, his fingerprints remain. Every time a prosecutor outlines a Mafia trial. Every time a film depicts a gangster council. Every time a young kid on the street dreams of climbing the ranks of an invisible empire, they're following a ghost. Because Luciano's genius wasn't just in what he built. It was in how he became immortal without ever needing the crown. He didn't need statues or headlines. He built his immortality in whispers, in rules, in a structure that still echoes in the underworld. And so, when the final chapter closes, when the last gangster falls, one truth will remain: there was before Lucky Luciano, and there was asterisk after. Asterisk, and the after will always carry his name. Lucky Luciano may have died in 1962, but his empire didn't. His body was lowered into the ground, but the world he shaped kept moving, adapting, evolving. In every mob trial, in every headline, in every story told in hushed voices, his shadow lives on. And maybe that was his greatest trick of all, not to live forever, but to make sure the game he invented never dies.